Hello. In the latest episode of the A is for Architecture podcast, Jeana Ripple, Chair and Vincent and Eleanor Shea Professor in the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia, joined me to discuss her recent book, Type 5 City, Codifying Material Inequity in Urban America, published by the University of Texas Press this year as part of their Roger Fullington series in architecture. In Type 5 City, Jeana describes how building codes or regulations in the USA have shaped urban landscapes. Specifically, Jeana explores how the construction of light, combustible wood-frame buildings, known as Type 5 constructions, have codified inequities in social, economic, environmental and health outcomes for residents. We discuss this idea, the entrenchment of ethics in the materials of building making, but also where the technology is restricted, in the exacerbation of labour inequalities.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the A is for Architecture podcast. I'm delighted to be talking today to Jeana Ripple. Jeana, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. We're going to be talking about your book, The Type 5 City, Codifying Material Inequity in Urban America, which you published with the University of Texas Press this year. Jeana, before we talk about that, it's a fascinating book, completely out of my comfort zone, which is partly why I approached you. But before we get to that, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Yes, Ambrose, it's really delightful to meet you and to thank you for the invitation to talk to you and your listeners. As you mentioned, my name is Jeana Ripple. I'm a professor of architecture at the University of Virginia, and I am looking forward to discussing this book with you.
So how do you get to be a professor at the University of Virginia? How did you get there?
It was a circuitous path for me. I didn't actually start my career in architecture at all. I started studying engineering and computer science and worked in that field for a little while. And so, there was a kind of curiosity about patterns that I think were part of the way that I thought early on that came back into being important in this book. But I decided I was interested in architecture and the built environment and saw that as a kind of very creative field and decided to go back to school to study architecture. And then I practiced for a while. I didn't necessarily see myself teaching, although I enjoyed a little bit of teaching as a graduate student. And then had the opportunity to apply for this position after coming straight out of practice into academia. So I mostly approach teaching as a practitioner, and even scholarship the questions that arise for me come out of things that I notice in practice. And I'm lucky to be in an academic setting where we have some time and resources to devote to trying to answer those questions.
I assume you did a PhD?
I did not.
Did you not?
I did a master's.
I see. That was in architecture, because I think this is where it's interesting to me, because the difference in the American system of education that you can go in off the back of a different degree to get your architectural master's kind of thing.
Yes. In our system, you can do a longer master's degree from any undergraduate degree. And then also in some of our professional schools, like architecture and laws, a little bit like this, we tend to draw from some backgrounds that are more scholarly, PhD studies, and some that are more kind of practice-based, that both need to exist in these professional schools.
That's really interesting. So you mentioned patterns, and then you mentioned this book. That's an interesting jump. And you also mentioned this idea of the kind of way you turn your imagination towards the practical aspects of architecture. How did you get to this book? So where does this book come from in your own thinking? And I guess it's probably time to introduce the central thesis or theses of it as well.
Well, it came from a curiosity from practice, some things that I noticed just being an architect and existing and traveling to visit different cities around the country. I noticed how different the neighborhoods were, and in ways that weren't explained by density necessarily or by zoning, that you would see neighborhoods in Chicago, for example, that were completely dominated by brick masonry, and then a few blocks away, completely dominated by wood frame. And then you travel to Philadelphia and see almost entirely brick masonry, and come to the South and see almost entirely wood frame. And so I just started to be curious about why did these patterns emerge this way? I was also noticing that the way we talked about codes in architecture was very different from the way that we talked about codes in computer science. That codes in architecture set a trajectory, but we don't necessarily study the outcomes or set them up to analyze parameters over time. So they're a very different kind of code than the kind we think about in computation. And so I was curious to see if I could think about architectural codes from a more computational perspective. What did we produce over the last 200 years from all these rules?
That's a fascinating idea. So you're saying that when you talk about codes, maybe we would talk about regulation or policy. That's essentially the same thing, isn't it?
Yes.
And who determines codes? How are they determined? Who deploys them and who ensures they're complied with in the American system?
It used to be that the cities, individual cities, would determine these codes within their ordinances. And they would do that usually through setting geographic boundaries. So in kind of turn of the century Chicago, the city of Chicago was determining these rules by itself, and they were determining where a geographic boundary might be placed on fire resistant construction, for example. Over time, that shifted to more of a formula and that was shared across regions. And then ultimately, now it's shared across most of the country. And we utilize what's called a model code that states and cities choose to adopt or amend. And that model code is set by an NGO. So it's not a governmental entity that sets that model code. They receive input from a lot of industrial representation, builders, product manufacturers, and policymakers. But ultimately, they kind of set that set of national defaults that is then adopted or amended by individual cities. And I was going to say, you mentioned getting to the central premise of the book. And I think one of the things I hope readers take away is that these codes claim to be uniform. So these entities that produce the codes use names like International Building Code or Uniform Building Code. But the outcomes at the scale of the city are really anything but uniform. And in ways that over time can't be fully explained by zoning or economics or even development timeline. So there were other priorities that were at play in the interpretation and deployment of these rules in American cities over the last century and a half.
That's really good context. I suppose the parallel here would be what we call building regulations. And these, I think we're up to like the letter T from building regulation A, part A, as it's called, all the way down to T or something like that. And it started to take in new things like electronic cabling for battery-powered vehicles. But the main ones at the beginning, part A, part B, part C, these are to do with structure, to do with fire, to do with mobility, access, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. Ventilation. Is this what the codes are doing? They are stipulating certain spatial and structural standards for the design and construction of buildings?
Yes. And the claim, that the tagline that is often used for the American codes is they protect health, safety, and welfare. So it's a pretty lofty goal that is then interpreted in all these very specific ways within the regulation. The one that I'm focused on in this book is really how they regulate material choice. And that is only through the lens of fire resistance. That is the only thing that these codes pay attention to when it comes to what you're allowed to build out of for a certain building in a certain place.
It's very interesting, again, because in recent years, post fire disaster in the United Kingdom called the Grenfell Tower disaster from 2017,
Yes.
which comes up in so many of the podcasts I do, there's been a turn again towards fire and life safety in buildings. So it's become again a really major thing, and this is obviously a good thing in some respects. But could you talk a little bit about this kind of central issue that you found, and how has this, as you call it, Type 5 construction manifest?
So within the American building codes, there are 5 construction types that are basically 5 fire resistance categories. Type 5 is not at all fire resistant. Type 1 is non-combustible and protected. It's not going to fall apart if it's exposed to flames. So type 5 is typically light wood frame in the United States, and it was very prominent in many cities globally as at the early stages of development. But in the United States, unlike some other parts of the world, like Europe, it didn't phase out completely over time. It remained prominent in most of the urban areas in the United States, as some neighborhoods were allowed to continue to build out of lightwood framing even today. And this was due to abundant wood resources in the United States. It was due to the time that those cities were evolving and the evolution at the same time of some firefighting mitigation systems and the affordability and accessibility of that system over time and still today. So type 5 is now an American default. Most people in the United States don't even question what you're going to build out of. Of course, you're going to build out of lightwood framing, which is not the case in many other parts of the world. And the question, but as you said, the questions of whether that's safe and in what contexts is it safe when we see disasters like the Grenfell Tower or even like the wildfire disasters in parts of North America,
Or in
I think
Palisades?
is more prevalent. Yes, it's definitely it's come to the forefront again in a way that maybe it hadn't for quite a bit of time. Um, I I think interestingly also there's many other types of risks that cities are facing now at the American cities because of the age of the building stock, because of other climate change related risks. So that is part of the interest in the book, is saying, well, what are all of these other areas of opportunity or risk that relate to building material choices?
What is the form of the construction that you're talking about? I'm assuming you're talking about approximately 1 foot thick, 300 millimeter thick walls, external walls, approximately 4 inches or 110 millimeter thick internal walls. It's all built out of C15 or C24 softwood, and then it's clad in what we call plasterboard here. I think you call something else in America. And then it's insulated within that with obviously all your membranes. Is that is this what you're talking about? And then in the American context, I'm assuming that this is then clad in wood as well, or is this brick clad?
Exactly. So we're talking about you know, oftentimes it's 6 inches nominally, the kind of size of the lumber that's used on the exterior walls. But then it has several layers of cladding on the interior and the exterior. As you said, gypsum board, typically on the interior, wood that is either oriented strand board or plywood, some kind of engineered exterior cladding. And then there's an increasingly complicated relationship between moisture and wrapping of the building and insulation that over time, the early days of this wood frame construction didn't include any of that. Over time, that's become more sophisticated and then also more challenging to, it requires more expertise and more trades to really get that right in contemporary construction.
it seems an extraordinarily expendable way of building buildings. There's no longevity built into this type of construction that you're talking of. This kind of material requires almost permanent maintenance because of vermin, because of mold, because of, as you say, moisture and the ingress of moisture into buildings. So where does this construction form come from? Like, how did it become so dominant, given the manifest problems that it has?
It's pretty fascinating to look into the ways that they talked about this form of construction in the early days of kind of settlement of the American West or development of American cities. People debated whether this was an appropriate way to build. And for example, Thomas Jefferson wrote about this in Notes on Virginia, saying that this wasn't a suitable form of nation building because of all of these issues of maintenance over time. And that, they talked about foreigners would come and kind of sneer at our way of temporary, our shoddy temporary construction. But this is part of what we have to do to get started. I mean, this was the way that some of the early pattern books wrote about this form of construction. They said, we will build this way or not at all. And they wrote about, if you are a single family settling for the first time in the frontier, this is how you build. Start with an 11-foot by 14-foot pantry. And you can build that in 2 days. Then you can sleep in there and store your food. And then next, add a kitchen of this size. And this will take you this much wood in these many days. So it was very much part of this culture of self-reliant beginnings. And when that way of building reached cities, it was typically talked about as this is just temporary. We're going to build this way for a while, and then over time, people will be able to invest in more robust forms of construction, and the fabric of the city will change. But that didn't happen in a lot of places, and it was publicly debated. Workers would strike and march on City Hall in Chicago in order to claim their right to continue to build in a way they could afford on their land. And over time, I think it became just culturally accepted that this is part of the norm in contemporary construction. I think the codes helped with that because they became so complicated that it no longer went from being a public debate about where do we build and how do we build through these geographic limits to being a formula that very few people understand or pay attention to. And 100 years later, just accept that, well, experts have figured that out, so it must be safe. It must produce good outcomes. And this book is claiming we should probably be looking at that as a public localities, looking at what we produce and what its benefits are and what its downsides are.
Yeah, that's a very good point. But I want to come back to this idea of code and this idea of an urban algorithm. And the central premise of your book, as I read it, is that, and obviously the title suggests so I don't think it's a wildly outlandish claim, is that inequality has followed close in the footsteps of this codification. And that codification has leveraged, in a way, inequality. And particularly this type of construction, type 5 construction. So I kind of wanted to understand this a little better. How does this algorithmic thing happen? And how does this bake in this inequality? And how do we see it? Because you've mentioned different cities having it, but that doesn't necessarily equate to inequality.
Right. So I mentioned that we see differences in the material patterns across different cities. And what I found was that some of those material patterns connect to or maybe lock into place some differential economic, labor, environmental, or health advantages or disadvantages. And sometimes those fall along racial lines, primarily because of segregation in certain cities, but sometimes they don't. So a couple examples in New York, the places in the city that with the most concentration of type 5 wood frame construction are also some of the most low-lying flood-prone areas. So this is a more vulnerable to mold, more absorptive material that is concentrated in the floodplains. So we see that particularly when there are disasters like Hurricane Sandy, that there's a disproportionate impact on some of these neighborhoods. There's more mold, more reports of mold as a result. These buildings suffer the most damage, and yet we rebuilt out of the same system after the hurricane. Or in Chicago, I was looking at maintenance demands over time and economic impacts like city or neighborhood scale disinvestment, and finding that there was a very strong connection between areas that were predominantly wood frame construction and types of evidence of disinvestment like foreclosure or abandonment rates, which to me made a connection that if you have to put more money more often into the upkeep of a neighborhood, it's more vulnerable to economic downturn than maybe some other neighborhoods that don't require the same level of upkeep of their buildings. So, you asked about was this inequity a result of the codes? And I think it may not have been the target, but I think there were certain priorities that underpinned the way these rules were made, and things like business priorities or labor influence, and there were other neighborhoods or other priorities that were neglected, and that's what produced some of these imbalances.
In the production of these codes, Type 5 code, for example, have you found evidence that developers, particularly volume house builders, are instrumental in defining and developing these codes? Because, of course, to me, the thing that jumps out is it's cheap, and therefore, if developers have to produce, for example, and I don't know what the case is in the United States, but in the UK, commercial housing developments have to include provision of certain quantities of affordable or social housing. And so obviously these for-profit companies with shareholders are going to be producing cheaper housing for poor people. I mean, I don't think that would be a wild conspiracy theory to suggest maybe that's happening. And likewise in America, I suppose the same must be true.
Yes. So I think the first point about do developers have an influence? And then also, are there different ways of building for different markets? I think developers, they definitely have a strong influence in setting the building codes. Like the American Home Builders Association, there was a bit of a scandal a few years ago where the New York Times published that the American Home Building Association had a kind of secret deal with the building code, the model code organization for, and maybe outsized participation on certain committees. So yes, there's a very strong influence on the production of building codes. And historically, we saw that in certain product organizations would lobby for certain codes, like the Plasters Association in almost 100 years ago tried to increase the amount of plaster that was required in a wall to make it fireproof. So that's not kind of a new influence. And then the question is, but I think on the other hand, on the flip side of that, you also have developers who feel that they are at the mercy of the market's demands. And so if the kind of cultural acceptance of this way of building doesn't allow them to charge more for perhaps a more robust material, then they are locked into having to compete with those producing the cheapest form of construction. And I do think that there's less public awareness of the perhaps different maintenance requirements and it's definitely not reflected in the way that housing is priced. It's priced based on bedroom counts and bathroom counts and not based on exterior wall material.
Yeah.
But then the question of, are developers building in different ways for different markets, like affordable development versus market rate? I don't think we see that very much in the kind of single family housing. That is almost uniformly wood frame construction at all different market levels. I have heard some developers talk about that difference when it comes to mid-rise construction, that market rate might use more stable materials like extruded metal framing or concrete, whereas affordable developers might be more restricted to using many stories of Type 5 construction.
You talk about labor participation as one of the
Mm.
ways that this inequity is baked into this system. Could you talk about that a little bit? Because as you're talking, one of the things that jumps out at me is that timber frame construction, particularly stick construction, rather than lumber construction. So using timbers up to 8 inches, 200 mil by 75 mil, 3.5 inches, is very, very easy to do. Like, you don't need huge quantities of machinery. It comes to site prepared. A couple of guys can pick it up. You can cut it by hand. You can use tools if you're lucky. So that the construction is very quick. It's relatively dry, which is obviously hugely advantageous to everybody. And more to the point, once constructed, it can be modified very, very easily.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So to me, there seems to be in terms of like the labor of producing these buildings, they seem to be much better than, say, for example, concrete or steel, which is highly technical and requires incredible lifting machinery for it. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about this idea of this labor participation.
The labor question, I think, is a fascinating one because it's so much a part of the equation of why people choose to build out of certain materials. Do they have access to the expertise to accomplish the project? And the low skill, the kind of low upfront need for skill was very much part of what solidified Type 5 construction in the United States early on, that anyone could do this, anyone could learn how to do this themselves, was sort of part of the culture. Today, I think, well, let me go back to your question about how do we see labor having a kind of relationship with the codes. In some places, like this is the chapter on Philadelphia, talks about how labor was really a kind of economic opportunity for an economic stabilizer, particularly construction labor opportunities in the United States was used throughout the 20th century at times of economic downturn to provide a kind of robust middle class working opportunity. So in some places like Philadelphia, where there was a strong craft culture, that probably helped them maintain a really strict building code that demanded high labor materials. So Philadelphia is almost completely built out of brick. And part of that kind of strong labor force is credited as part of the reason that those codes evolved that way. But there was also quite a bit of controversy over who had access to those jobs and whether or not over time, and protests and affirmative action in the United States started over the access to construction labor jobs. So one of the opportunities that I think is under recognized or maybe underappreciated is, as architects, when we specify building material, how can we look at who has the opportunity to have a job coming out of that? That it's not just necessarily about reducing labor, reducing time and cost, but if we talk about affordability, can we think about it as also a job opportunity as much as we're thinking about it as keeping upfront costs down? And there's a famous architect who practiced in the 80s in New York City named Max Bond who talked about that. And he said, I choose the material for the buildings that I design based on the composition of the labor union in the neighborhoods that I'm building. So I want to make sure people in this neighborhood have a chance to work on the building, and I choose materials accordingly.
What a guy.
Yeah.
What an incredibly interesting idea. How sort of far in advance, I suppose, of our own time.
Mm-hmm.
Your argument, however, isn't for a total disinvestment in Type 5 construction, as you described occurred in Chicago, I think, because there are advantages, distinct advantages too. And you talk about that in Tampa, I think, particularly this inherent flexibility of Type 5, which I guess comes back to this idea of the code, which is timber is the most hackable code in construction.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. I like thinking about it that way. So yes, I don't advocate for completely disinvesting in Type 5 construction, because there are ways in which that ethos of flexibility and change over time are really important. And in Tampa, for example, having a range of material types in very close proximity produced a kind of rich hybridity of opportunity for small business startups in some types of affordable construction, and live work in some places, and social gathering in other more robust forms of construction. So I think there's something to be learned from the need for some areas of robust construction and some areas of flexibility. So from a city scale perspective, I think the way that I think about it is if we looked at the city as geological material deposits, some areas we might say we want to invest in the buildup of long-term durable material infrastructure. And other areas we might say would benefit from the kind of temporary, more hackable, as you said, systems. So if we started to think about the city according to that logic, instead of saying this is a one-size-fits-all set of rules, we might produce something different. And similarly, at the building scale, there are models that architects have been talking about for quite some time, to think about, rather than a building as a one-time fixed entity, that they think about layers of material that might be designed to last different periods of time. So Stuart Brand wrote about this in the 60s, and groups that called themselves the open building movement in the Netherlands and in Japan, they were all talking about the same thing, which is kind of, how do you build for flexibility? How do you build a very sort of loose system of structure that has then flexibility and adaptability of the way the spaces are used and how some of the interiors are modified over time. So some of these kinds of hybrids, I think, at the scale of the city and at the scale of the building, are ways that we can think about more sophisticated material systems.
Going back to an earlier point you made about some of the inherent weaknesses in a softwood timber construction system and the potential impacts on health that might have, for example, through permeability or lack of permeability to moisture and to airflow, to the presence of mold, the significant presence of green and black mold in houses. And then obviously you've got vermin, cockroaches, ants, wasps, so on and so forth. Rats, unbelievable that they still exist, but they do.
They do. They'll outlive us all.
They'll outlive us all, they bloody will. But I did a podcast a while back with the chair of architecture at Cambridge University, Flora Samuel, which was about one of her books on housing. And she had mentioned, I think, in there, encountering new construction in Britain where the houses had an expected sort of guaranteed lifespan of 10 years, like less than 10, 10 or below years or something like that. It was kind of shocking. And you think this is outrageous. But at the same time, there is a kind of, to go back to this idea of the algorithm, there's a kind of idea of replaceability being built into this, a built-in obsolescence, which could be seen as a way of designing out pathology as well. And I only say this because I live in a house that's 120 years old, which is not old for around here. And I'm doing it up bit by bit. And the thing that strikes me when I take down a bit of old plaster, lath plaster wall is A, how badly it's made, and B, how disgustingly dirty it is in a
Mm.
fundamental way. And actually how in our desire for, living in historic environments, living in properly made brick, it's a brick house.
Mm.
Actually, what we do is we kind of ensure that within quite a short period of time, we're going to be living in a vermin infused dust box, which is without a shadow of a doubt going to give you lung infection. But it looks nice because
Mm.
it's old. So I wonder whether there is, to a certain extent, an advantage in this kind of type 5 construction, which is that, yes, it's
Mm.
very impermanent and it disappears quite quickly. And then we do it again and it's clean again. I mean, I know that sounds a bit odd, but that's quite a Japanese idea, I think. This idea of the impermanent house.
Yes. I think there's a way to think about, like Japan, as you said, and Australia are two other global locations where wood frame is very prominent. And I think there are important cultural differences that really take advantage, accept the temporal nature of it and say, we're going to build it that way. So in Japan, maybe there's not as much layering of plastic and and infill of the kind of mold prone insulation because there's an acceptance of this isn't going to last forever. We're going to have to upkeep it over time,
Hmm.
or replace it over time. And so, we're going to build it to anticipate that replacement. Or, for example, in Australia and in the UK, there are very sophisticated guidelines about what species you use in according to certain types of um, zones of risk, geographies of risk. So, for example, is this an area that's very prone to termites and other vermin, as you said, or is this an area that's very prone to flooding and moisture? And then there's hundreds of species that are listed that say these are the most moisture resistant species, wood species to build out of, or these are the most resistant to termites and other infestations. Um, so there's a kind of intelligence, I think, in both of those cultural uses of wood building that say we're going to really take advantage of what we know about time and environment and
Hmm.
tune the choice of wood to those realities. Whereas my critique of the way we do build type 5 construction in the US is we tend to infuse it with chemicals as a way to protect it from certain risks and layer it up, with a lot of attempts to resist moisture, like plastic, and attempts to increase the durability. And those might not ultimately be taking, the kind of finely tuned approaches that we need that would give some of the advantages that you're mentioning.
Kind of interested in I guess, the philosophical scholarly positioning of this. Does your work fit within a
Mm.
broader reconceptualizing of the materiality of architecture? And I'm not talking about that in the phenomenological or
Mm.
philosophical sense necessarily, but rather from the sense of in a actor network theory sense, that it seems to me to be part of the material turn in architecture. And there's been some books written in recent years that have started to explore this a lot, which I feel your book is part of. And there's a whole host of literature now emerging that's looking at the broader ethic of what we build with, rather than just what we build. Were you conscious of your positionality within that discourse? And I guess, how do you kind of locate yourself there, if you do?
hmm I think the realms of influence that I thought a lot about were, on one hand, thinking about the literature around zoning, critique of zoning codes, which is prolific. There's a lot of scholarly discussion on, and in particular, the social impact that zoning regulation creates in American cities or in cities in general. But not necessarily, building codes have not been part of that discourse in a significant way. And then part of, I think, what you're alluding to, on the other hand, is increasingly a systems level repositioning of building technology from some of the scholars that you mentioned and others. I think Kiel Mo is part of that discussion as well, starting to say if we look at energy or material or specifications from a broader perspective, not just how do we make the building more efficient, but how do we look at the whole system, whole life cycle, for example. What are the boundaries of this system that we're considering? I think I feel like I'm trying to put those two things together, saying these regulations have a social impact and these building technologies need to be thought of in terms of their broader impact.
I think that's really good. It seems to me that what this turn in scholarship is about is a rejection of this idea that the built environment is something on which architects do things, and the materials that they do them with are both ambivalent. And the idea of building codes, and I think you implied this earlier, this reliance upon building codes, well, if it's in the code, it must be okay, is in a way a demoralization and a de-agentsification of things that actually do have agency. Not in the sense of human agency, perhaps, but certainly are subject to human agency insofar as they are the product of concerted human activity. And it could have been done otherwise. It doesn't need to be this way. And it seems to me that there's a foundational layer of a new politics of the stuff of the world, which I find very fascinating.
I appreciate that. And one of the most insightful comments I received during the peer review process was an external reviewer saying, is this really about building codes at all? Or is this about power and the American city? And I thought, this is true. You could say the latter, that it's really about what were the influences, who was in power, what did they prioritize? And building codes was just one instrument of agency, as you said. But on the flip side, as those of us who are in the business of designing the built environment, this is also an area where we can tap into those power systems and try to maybe reveal more of a debate about what is the ethics of something that seems as neutral as building regulation. What does it actually produce and who benefits?
Yeah. The question that I posed to you and the questions I sent through was to do with how do we unpick this? What steps are required to unpick this inequity that's built within this type 5 construction system? So what practical steps can be done? Not, as we said earlier, to do away with it, but to improve it, to make it appropriate for the contemporary context, which will therefore also include labor participation and inherent flexibility. But everything needs to be upgraded. So what should we do? Or what can be done?
Yeah.
What would be a quick win?
The quick win would be saying, what would it take to incentivize flexibility, to design for adaptation over time? And what are the barriers to that? Because there are some very simple barriers about what you need to do to get a certificate of occupancy and certain HVAC and egress codes, and what would maybe push us in that direction. I think that could be the kind of thing that students and professionals could study together in a really productive way. And then I think the longer term effort would be, how do we increase public engagement and localized interest in this? I would love to see more people looking at these material patterns, asking different questions, studying them, debating them. I think we have different access to this data than we've had. The use of something like GIS and public city data is fairly recent. From most of the 20th century, it was only the insurance companies and maybe mortgage lenders who kind of had access to this full picture of what we build out of across cities. So this is a moment that I think we can say, let's look at this as a discipline or as a kind of collective and have more debate about what we want to do and include more voices. And then I think you touched on this a little bit earlier. There are new materials that are exciting and offer kind of in between. It's not all the dusty, heavy masonry or the kind of flimsy type 5 construction. The in between are really, I think, where the answer lies, that new forms of engineered heavy timber don't have some of the same vulnerabilities, do sequester carbon, do offer longer spans, or even some of the kind of more robust exterior systems with wood infill offer some labor opportunity and some use of, flexible interior spaces. So those are, I would say, where I see some of the answers coming through.
Great. That's a wonderful point to finish on. Very, very interesting starting gun for, I hope, further work, because I think it's a really, really great area of study. So thank you so very much, Jeana, for speaking with me.
So nice to speak to you, Ambrose. Thank you so much for engaging in this conversation.
It was a cord of maple cut and split and piled and measured 4 by 4 by 8, and not another like it I could see. That's from The Woodpile by Robert Frost, and it's very good, very autumnal. Also, it mentions wood. Thanks to Jeana for speaking with me and for being such a forgiving and patient interlocutor. Thanks to Elizabeth Winkler at the University of Texas Press for the intro and the book. Please see the podcast description for links to the book and to Jeana at work and on the socials. And thanks for listening.